Hi, everyone. Welcome to Doing Sociology. We are here with a brand new book discussion with Dr. Nikhil Menon on his latest manuscript, which is called Planning Democracy, Modern India's Quest for Development, which was published by the Cambridge University Press. Nikhil Menon is an assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. He's a historian of modern South Asia, specializing in the political and economic history of 20th century India. He was educated at Delhi University and Jawaharlal Nehru University in India and completed his PhD in history at Princeton University. His first book is Planning Democracy, How a Professor, an Institute, and an Idea Shaped India. It was published in India by Penguin and outside by the Cambridge University Press. And this book was awarded the Joseph W. Elder Prize in the Indian Social Sciences by the American Institute for Indian Studies. So welcome, Nikhil. Welcome to this discussion, and very happy to have you with us today. So
I would like to. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So could you talk about the genesis of your book?
Yes, thank you. So my book really grew out of the research that I did in my PhD. I had moved from, as you said, from JNU in Delhi to the United States for my PhD. And I think that the change in both geographical and intellectual setting either coincided with or led to a desire to work on a very different subject and on something new. Because for my MPhil in JNU, I was working on something quite radically different on the labor history of Madras. And I quickly decided when I left that I wanted to work on something new. And I started thinking about what interested me as a reader of Indian history at that time. And I was drawn to the idea of looking at what happens in this very exciting period in Indian history after independence. Because growing up in India, as you said, studying in Madras and then Delhi for 7 years, I had done courses in Indian history from antiquity onwards, but I'd never done a course on India or South Asia after independence. And so there was actually a lot of questions that I wanted answered for myself. And so I broadly came to the conclusion that I wanted to work on India in this sort of foundational or founding moment or period. And there were a few ideas that I toyed with, but ultimately I settled on planning. And the reason I settled on planning was precisely because of the dichotomy between how boring planning was considered in the years that I was growing up in the 1990s in India, and how exciting it seemed to have been for people in the 1950s. Why was this something that, say, in Nehru's speeches or in speeches by leading intellectuals of the time, that they spoke about planning in these almost romantic terms, right? So that dichotomy between it seeming so outdated and really a sort of zombie idea by the 1990s, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, that distinction between and the contradistinction between how it seemed in the 1990s and 2000s versus how it seemed to have been perceived in the 1950s and 60s was particularly appealing to me. And so I wanted to study how it is that this idea became so mainstream, how it became so popular across a range of political ideologies, from Gandhians to communists to socialists to Congressites, even to the Jan Sangh. Why were they all talking about planning in different modes? And I was fortunate to be in an environment in graduate school at a place where I had academic mentors and who were encouraging of this, but also amongst graduate students who also had their own interests in independent India. And so I feel lucky to have been a part of a cohort of students who have now sort of published research on independent India, and being around them definitely helped a great deal.
So in your book, you talk about the fact that planning after independence was a mode of nation building, state formation, as well as legitimation in India. So could you throw some light on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to answer that, I hope it's okay if you don't mind if I say a few words on what the book is about. So the book is really about what I think of as one of the great projects or experiments of the 20th century, how India tries to combine both Soviet-inspired economic planning with Western-inspired liberal democracy, especially during the Cold War, when these ideas are really pitted as fundamentally oppositional or incompatible with each other. And so the book tries to explore how planning became so central to modern India, and it looks at planning as a lens by which to understand the Indian state, the post-colonial state. And it looks at how planning came to dominate public life, how politics, civic life, and really it's looking beyond whether the plan succeeded or failed, which is what I think a lot of the literature till now looked at through the work of economists and policymakers. It's not about economic performance, but rather about how planning captures the minds of India's elite and sometimes India's public political imagination as well. And so when I say that that planning was a mode of nation building, what I'm referring to is the manner in which planning became this kind of master narrative or meta narrative about post-colonial India. That the government was using the language of planning as a way to convey to citizens a kind of diagnosis of what ailed India, of the ills of contemporary India or colonial India, presenting a map to the future of what India could be, and offering directions to citizens of how the plans, the 5-year plans, the Panchvarsha Yojana, will allow people to move forward towards this developing India. And at a time in which, in the 1950s, when the nation form is still, in its infancy, the republic is just a few years old, the rhetoric of planning is one of the ways in which the idea of the Indian Republic and this idea of a shared common purpose was conveyed to citizens. And so that's the way in which it's a form of nation building. Now, how is it a form of state formation? Here, with state formation, I'm referring to the ways in which planning, I argue, is causally involved or enables the establishment of a vast knowledge infrastructure or data infrastructure that continues to be used by the contemporary Indian state. Specifically, I'm referring to the vast national statistical infrastructure that is set up over the 1950s and 1960s, and the first use of digital computers, both of which, of course, are still used in policymaking today. So that is the state formation that I'm talking about, how planning contributes to the formation of the modern Indian state. And finally, when I'm talking about how planning became a mode of legitimation or a mode of legitimizing the state, I'm talking about how the Indian state draws legitimacy from its association through planning with the work of development. It's been an argument made by others as well that the post-colonial Indian state distinguished itself from the colonial state by associating itself not with exploitation, but instead with development, right? That the argument of the nationalists, Indian nationalists, or the Congress nationalists at least, was that the colonial state was bad for Indians because it economically exploited Indians. And so in some ways, the very justification of a post-colonial state was that it would help India develop economically. And I think that through the language of planning, the Indian state was associating itself with this project of development. And by fusing the Indian state with this project of development in the eyes of the people, the Indian state is then able to portray itself as the legitimate possessor of post-colonial power. And so that's the way in which I'm saying that planning was a mode of nation building, a mode of state formation, and a method of legitimizing the state.
Right. And thank you for that response. So what do you think would be the knowledge infrastructure that underlined India's developmental aspirations? And how was it linked to this process of planning?
Yeah, so essentially what I'm arguing in the first half of my book is that centralized planning of the kind that India adopted, I mean, of course, not centralized in quite the same way as the Soviet Union or China had, but still centralized to a considerable degree, that this centralized planning required huge masses of data about the economy in order for it to function. This is something that I found in correspondence between nationalist leaders from the 1930s, late 1930s onwards, that if we are going to have this planned state or a state in which planning is going to play an important role, we need data about the economy. But this is information that we actually lack. As Nehru would write, I think in the early 1940s, we need data to plan, but as of now, we function in the dark. And so it is in order to provide the data that planning required that India sets up this vast national statistical infrastructure. And then, just as now, there existed this quite utopian view that if you had enough data, then solutions would become apparent. And PC Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta offered ways by which planners could accumulate such data, which is why through the first half of my book, I track Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute because of how important they would be to providing the Planning Commission with the data that was crucial or seen as crucial to successful planning in India. And just to give you an example, perhaps the signal achievement of this era, or the most lasting contribution of the era to Indian social scientific practice was the National Sample Survey, which, as you all very well know, exists until today. India still collects National Sample Survey data, and this was really a revolution in India's data capacities. It started in 1950, and the idea was to have this sort of series of nationwide surveys that would collect information on a range of aspects of citizens' economic life. And the logic of the sample survey, which is something that was developed at ISI, at the Indian Statistical Institute, from the 1940s onwards, was that it would be impossible or too expensive to collect information or statistics from every household in India. And so it was better to develop a representative sample, right? That's why it's called the sample survey. And so that the whole could be calculated from the sample or from this fraction. And it ended up being the biggest and most comprehensive sampling inquiry ever conducted in the world. In the book, I go into the kinds of challenges that the investigators of the Indian Statistical Institute went into or had to encounter in order to collect this first sample survey. But the results were quite extraordinary, I think, because they provide an amazing level. I'm saying extraordinary, not whether in a value judgment terms of whether it's good or bad for the country, but in terms of the achievement that it represented, in terms of how much more data the state could mine from its citizenry. And since then, we've had a national sample survey consistently, which has provided the data upon which we measure things like the poverty line in India, or the levels of poverty in India. All of that, the National Sample Survey is crucial for. And it's also made contributions, not just in India, but it was seen as a pioneering venture globally. Most statisticians in the world at the time did not think that you could do a sample survey at this scale. And the fact that India was able to do it was seen as a real achievement for social scientific practice in the global south. And since then, many of the methods that have been used by the National Sample Survey have been used by the UN and the World Bank in their surveys in hundreds of countries, including up till today. And the other sort of social scientific or knowledge infrastructure aspect that I talk about in my book is the role of computers or digital computers and their association with planning. And again, to put it very simply, India's first computers came to India because of India's desire to centrally plan the economy. Again, planning required this vast, had this sort of thirst for data. The National Sample Survey, for example, helped provide the data, but then that posed the problem of, well, what do you do with the data? How do you crunch all these numbers? Do you just have human beings or working on desk calculators? Or do you use this, what seemed like a revolutionary technology at the time in the 1950s, digital computers, do you use them to crunch this data? And so unlike in other parts of the world where computers first came in order for military purposes, in India, actually, the first two computers came to Calcutta, to the campus of the Indian Statistical Institute, in order to work calculations for the Planning Commission.
Right. Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Nikhil, now, moving from the question of the knowledge infrastructure, we'd like you to talk a little bit about, how the democratic planning in India, where would you locate that on the ideological spectrum? And could you also take us through the different debates or the events which led to that particular kind of democratic planning?
Yes. Again, just for listeners or viewers who haven't had an opportunity to look at the book, just a little bit on what democratic planning meant. So democratic planning was this phrase that I came across in the archives repeatedly when Congress leaders or members of the Indian government would talk about how planning was to be conveyed to the people of India. And the idea of democratic planning was that Indian planning had to be very different from planning in the Soviet Union or in China, basically from communist planning, because in India, democratic planning required persuasion to be used instead of force, right? That unlike in communist regimes, in India, the government was not able to wield the stick as much as the carrot. And so democratic planning, the idea was that Indians, in order to be good citizens, needed to be aware of what was happening with the state. The state, in order to be a good faith state and government, needed to inform the citizens about what was happening with the plans, but also that popular participation was a part of what being an Indian citizen was. This is something that other scholars like Nitya Gopal Jayal have talked about, this idea of Indian citizenship being not just that the idea of Indian citizenship coming with duties and obligations. And I think that one of these duties and obligations was to work towards economic development. And how was economic development defined? The vehicle of it, of course, in post-colonial India was through planning. And so I think that democratic planning was a mixture of idealism about democracy and popular participation and citizenship, but also layered under it was a quite pragmatic realism about the limitations of Indian state capacity. The Indian government was aware that the Indian state, unlike, say, the Soviet state, just did not have the wherewithal to make these plans work. Well, it's a different debate about whether even the Soviet plans work, but even compared to the Soviet Union, that the Indian state did not have quite the same architecture or resources at its disposal in order to effect these 5-year plans. And in order for them to be effective or to have any purchase on the ground, the Indian state would require the help of citizens, would require the voluntary contributions of citizens, would require Indian citizens to save, invest, and participate in economic activity in broad accordance to what the 5-year plans said was best for the country. And of course, the Indian state had very few sticks at its disposal, but mostly carrots and incentives that it lay out. And one of the incentives that it tried to lay out was to say that, well, this is how you will be a good citizen of India. Now coming to your question about how it figures in the political spectrum, that is a hard question to answer, but I try to offer some ways of thinking about it in the book. And the reason it is hard to answer is because of how popular planning had come to be in the 1940s and 1950s in India across the political spectrum, right? And so I suppose if I was pressed, I would say that democratic planning falls under the umbrella of Indian socialism. But I use that term Indian socialism specifically because Indian socialism is quite a vague term in the 1940s and 50s. There were many versions of Indian socialism. Indian socialism could comprise people or parties from the communist left to the socialist parties, to the Kisan Praja parties, to the Congress party, to even the Jansangh. All of them, as a number of scholars have pointed out, all of them claim to be socialists, right? And so socialism was this very broad umbrella term, which everyone wanted to have some association with, but was never really defined. And so I'd say that planning similarly was the sort of flavor of the season, just like socialism was, but everybody had their own sort of recipe for it. But what I'd say is that all of these kinds of socialisms and all of these different visions of planning shared amongst them the idea that popular mobilization was going to be important in the post-colonial era. And that was a central plank of the idea of democratic planning, that citizens were not just meant to be aware of the plans, but also willing participants in them. And so I'd say that that's where it falls within the Indian political spectrum, a broad idea shared by many parties that regardless of what kind of socialism you have, and that could be defined in many different ways, India was going to be socialistic. That was another phrase that was coined in the 1950s, socialistic, rather than just socialist. And that India would have some kind of planning. But undergirding all these different versions of socialism and planning is the idea of popular mobilization, which is of course used by the Congress government in all kinds of schemes, whether during times of food scarcity, asking citizens across the country to either eat only, to skip a meal, or to skip a meal of rice in favor of other grains. But in terms of planning, it could be to invest in gold or to not invest in gold, to not import, to sort of delay consumer gratification because the work of industrialization is more important right now, to invest in accordance with what the 5-year plans wanted, or to make voluntary contributions to a national plan loan, or to bonds. So these are different ways in which the Indian citizen is being asked to contribute to the government. And I think that is something that many parties share, this view that popular mobilization is important. And I think that this is popular mobilization today might seem extreme or might seem like a real reach. But I think to a generation of politicians that had been involved in popular mobilization for the freedom struggle, this did not seem very different, right? To them, it seemed like, well, we've been involved in this so far. Surely the work of development requires us to continue this further as well.
Right. So, when you talk about popular mobilizations, you write in your book how the Indian government made conscious attempts to reach out to the citizenry, right? With obviously the purpose of convincing them for the need of this kind of planning. So could you just elaborate on some of the ways in which the government reached out to the people?
Yes, and this is something that I was really quite surprised by, to find this real range or array of ways in which the government was reaching out to people. I found in the files of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting an entire section called FYPP. There was a sort of code that was used, or the acronym used, 5-year plan publicity. And under 5-year plan publicity, I found this whole plethora of ways in which the government was trying to spread the message of the 5-year plan. Now, the way to interpret that can be done variously. You can interpret that as the government being idealistic and trying to inform citizens about what's happening at the highest levels of government. You could look at it more skeptically or critically and say that this is just the government trying to get people to behave economically in accordance to the plan, because otherwise the 5-year plans will fail. So it's doing it in their own self-interest. But the ways they went about doing this, again, whether you think of it as publicity or propaganda, and I go into which part of it is operational in which aspects in the book, regardless of whether it's publicity or propaganda, I think that looking at these different modes is important. And so under the 5-year plan publicity section, you find something called the Song and Drama Division. Now, the Song and Drama Division, again, is headed in New Delhi at the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. It includes members, sometimes including Ibrahim Al-Ghazi from the National School of Drama. It basically employs dozens of what are called publicity officers in districts across India, traveling in what are called bullock cart units, jeep units, boat units, and what they're doing on these jeeps, bullock carts, and boats is carrying publicity materials, film projectors, a film projector with a chadar, or with a blanket to put up between two trees and project a film that is produced, say, by the Films Division of India about what is the 5-year plan, what is it doing, what is it asking citizens to do, sharing publicity materials with perhaps the few educated people in some of these villages in order for them to read it out to others or to convey it to others in the village, to talk to them. Some of these publicity materials didn't require people to necessarily be literate, so it would just be visuals. So there's this whole bureaucracy of the Song and Drama Division. It would also employ, private dramatic troops and private, Nach and Gana troops to perform songs that are about the 5-year plans, to perform mushairas about the 5-year plans, to perform plays about the 5-year plans. One of the plays that I discuss in detail is one of the most prominent, is produced by one of the most prominent theatre groups in post-colonial India in the 1950s, called the Three Arts Club. And the Three Arts Club is basically given a commission by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting to come up with a play that has the themes of rural development and the 5-year plan in it. And the play that the playwright Ramesh Mehta comes up with is called Hamara Gaon. And I go into how the very plot of Hamara Gaon reveals the intent of the 5-year plan, of what 5-year plan publicity is about. So there's a song and drama division. There's something else called the University Planning Forum. This is something, again, quite fascinating. In the 1950s and 60s, numerous colleges, certainly the colleges that I went to in Delhi University, perhaps you've also been to in Delhi University, Madras University, Bombay University, Calcutta University, almost every central university in India had a university planning forum. And many colleges within those universities also had planning forums. And the idea of the planning forum is, again, perhaps naive, perhaps overly romantic, that students who are studying at universities are seen as the future intelligentsia of the country. And so it is incumbent upon them to be aware of what the 5-year plans are, what the role of their own role in the development of the nation is. And so they would be provided by the Planning Commission, or rather through the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, publicity materials, you might say, think of them as propaganda materials, on the 5-year plans. And then, so imagine yourself, like I was, say, at Ramdas College or at Hindu College or at IP College, and imagine yourself in these colleges and you get these materials. And the idea was that these materials would be used by the planning forum to have debates about, just like you have, intra or intercollegiate debates at universities. You would have debates about, should this be the focus? Should industry be the focus of the second 5-year plan? Or should it be the wage goods model? Or should it be focusing on agriculture, right? And these would be debates. Is there enough, enough emphasis on cost? Is there enough emphasis on the role of women in the 5-year plan? You could imagine all kinds of debates that students could have. And the idea was, again, perhaps very far-fetched, that the best ideas that emerged from all of these intra and intercollegiate debates, say, for example, in Delhi University, would filter up to the university level, from where it would be filtered to the inter-university debates between, say, Calcutta University or Bombay University, Madras University, and Delhi University. And then from there, the best ideas would filter up to the Planning Commission. And so the idea is that there will be this kind of feedback loop between educated citizens and planners about what citizens think about the plans. Of course, this did not work in practice. And over time, the planning forums ended up just being, intellectual discussion groups or debating forums, right? They just debated anything. In fact, one vestige of this is in St. Stephen's College still has something called the Planning Forum. And that, I think, it might come as a surprise to many people at the Planning Forum today, was set up in order to debate specifically 5-year plans. So they've maintained the name Planning Forum, but the form remains, but the content doesn't. But what exists today at St. Stephen's College existed across, perhaps more than 100 colleges across the country. So that's another form that the Planning Commission tried to reach out to people. But apart from that, there are, one of the major ways is the Films Division, which was the largest producer of documentary films in the world in the 1950s and 60s. And close to 40% of the films that it produced in the first 2 decades after independence were on development and or planning, right? So there's definitely an emphasis on development and planning in the production of the Films Division of India. The Films Division of India claimed that it reached up to 80 million people per week, because, of course, every film, as people of a certain age will know, if you grew up in the early 1990s, before any movie at a theater, even if it's, a Shah Rukh Khan movie, you'd watch, 15 or 10 minutes of a Films Division documentary, right? You'd watch this sort of small documentary from the Films Division. That was sort of multiplied many times over across the country in the 1950s and 60s. You would see Films Division documentaries all over the place. And so I study in the book some of these documentaries, and some films that are actually quite playful and entertaining that were produced by the Films Division. For example, look at one particularly entertaining movie called Shadow and Substance, which is about an alien visiting India every 5 years. And of course, these visits from the alien are timed to match the 5-year plan. And though, the villager in the animation villager in this movie complains about how nothing has happened to his life, there's no improvement, there's no vikas, of course. But the alien, through the alien's sort of point of view, he sees dramatic changes. And so in some ways, it's the government trying to tell us citizens that, you might not see, changes happening around you, but if you were objective, like the alien was, you'd see that actually lots of changes are happening in your life. Lastly, I just want to mention that I don't only look at the ways in which the government tried to propagate the plans, but also as a way to see whether it was successful or not, to see the ways in which planning seeped into popular culture as well. And that's why I look at, novels like Jhuta Sach by Yashpal, in which one of the protagonists is a member of the Planning Commission, and one of the few men in the novel who's actually sort of a good person, or seen or portrayed as a good person, is a member of the Planning Commission, Professor Pran Nath, who in some ways is like a kind of Mahalanobis figure, a kind of 5-year plan hero. I look at movies, at mainstream Bollywood movies like Naya Daur with Dhruv Kumar, Char Dil Char Rahein with Meena Kumari, Raj Kapoor, Shami Kapoor, again, which has the 5-year plan as a very sort of central theme and backdrop in the movie. And also at songs like Kamyab Hum Karke Rahenge, whose chorus goes, कह दो ये गांव के जाट को और शहर के जेंटलमैन को कामयाब हम करके रहेंगे 5 साल के प्लान को, right? And this is a song sung by Muhammad Rafi and Lata Mangeshkar, right? So it's a very mainstream song that you could imagine that if you're a teenager in 1950s India, you'd be singing about the 5-year plan. I mean, it would be analogous to if today's teenager is singing a song about, I don't know, the Jan Dhan Yojana, right? That is the equivalent of what that would be happening. And so I think that there is a way in which this idea of planning had purchased beyond just official discourse in popular culture and in popular discourse as well.
Right. I think it's a good time to mention that Dipali was in St. Stephen's and she was part of the planning forum as you were talking. And we also have
I guess I should learn more from you about, I mean, I'm interested in knowing, Dipali, was the 5-year plan mentioned at all?
Because, the planning forum towards, so I was associated maybe till the 2nd year of college. And by the time you reach the 3rd year, which is when all the, offices are allotted, that's when the history folks took over. I was in economics, so the eco folks had to go back to their econ society and the finance and investment cell. Yeah, but yeah, it was one of the societies which would have these discussions, like you just mentioned. Maybe not discuss the the plan so much, but have debates around things or issues that were happening, right? Yeah.
Just a side comment, really like the use of novels and films, and you talked about Shah Rukh Khan as well, because we have an upcoming series on Pathaan coming up on doing sociology, so it's quite exciting to look at all of these things. Nonetheless, so could you also talk about the Bharat Sadhu Samaj and the role that the Society of Ascetics played in conveying the plans to the people?
Yes, so the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, or for those who don't speak Hindi, the Indian Society of Ascetics, was also this thing that I found, I was really surprised, quite shocked by when I found in the archives. It's essentially a body that is created in early 1956 after a meeting between Congress politicians and sadhus or Hindu ascetics at Birla Mandir, at this sort of temple in Delhi. And despite what we sort of all know of Nehru's sort of, avowed secularism, he is the prime minister at the time. And despite him being aware of it and him being ambivalent about it, it is enthusiastically promoted by national figures like Gulzarlal Nanda, who is the Minister of Planning at the time, long-time Gandhian, future 2-time interim Prime Minister of India, and the President of India at the time, Rajendra Prasad, both of whom are seen as more sort of socially conservative, or at least very devout Hindus at the time. And the Bharat Sadhu Samaj is instituted on this belief that, and this is what Nanda is saying to Nehru, that, all these methods we're trying to reach out to people are very urban-centric, or using methods that appeal only to a certain kind of quote-unquote modern Indian. But if you really want to tap into popular culture and to get people who are perhaps illiterate, but just as much citizens of India, you need to use the resource of religion. not in a cynical manner, but actually Gulzar Nanda thought that this was actually a fitting use for planned publicity and for religion. And so he thought that by using the resource of religion and holy men, you could actually popularize 5-year plans across India's many, hundreds of millions of devout Hindus. And in the language of Nanda, Gulzar Nanda, by doing so, you could link the lok to the parlok, right? From this world to the next world. And Nehru remains very ambivalent, but is convinced that, perhaps at least it's worth engaging in this. And so the Bharat Sadhu Samaj from 1956 onwards starts getting funds from the government of India in order for sadhus to take up the language of the 5-year plans and to promote it at things like the Kumbh Mela. In their travels across the country, they would try to combine the stories of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata with the Panchvarsha Yojana. Unfortunately, I couldn't, find or locate any script that they actually, produced or a narrative of what the ways in which they actually did that. But they did talk about how this is what they desired to do. But to cut a long story short, I find this a particularly fascinating episode. What the Congress Party would find over time is that what they were doing by nurturing the Bharat Sadhu Samaj and associating themselves with these sadhus is that it would ultimately play into the hands of the parties that are in political opposition to the Congress Party, right? So Nehru's government is involved in this for a range of reasons. Indira Gandhi's government is involved in this for perhaps more cynical reasons, as I go into in the book. Herself showing up at the Kumbh Mela Pandal of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj when she's electioneering, when she's campaigning for her re-election. But the sadhus would prove to be, as you'd expect, very hard to control. The sadhus, of course, had their own agendas as well. They were sadhus before they were members of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. And they would end up over the 1970s and 80s, or actually even the mid-1960s, end up dragging the Congress Party into arenas which were actually the forte or strong points politically for the Jan Sangh and then the BJP. So, for example, in the 1966, during the sort of famous attack on Parliament, which was based on an anti-cow slaughter rally, that rally was led by many sadhus, and some of them were associated with the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. This was an attack on Parliament that led to the deaths of several people. It led to the army being called to the streets of New Delhi. And it also led to Gulzar Nanda, who was then the Home Minister of India under Indira Gandhi's government, being forced to resign because Gulzar Nanda had been so closely aligned with the Bharat Sadhu Samaj since 1956 onwards. Other ways in which it would boomerang on the Congress government would be in 1964, when the VHP, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, is formed. The founding vice president of the VHP was one Sant Tukroji Maharaj, who also happened to be the first president of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. By the 1980s, at the Kumbh Mela pandals of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, they are now talking about things about how the Ram Mandir needs to be built where the Babri Masjid is, right? So you see this venture that might have just seemed, ill-advised or perhaps quirky in the 1950s, leading by the late 1980s to something that would really eventually topple the Congress government itself.
Right.
Right. Sorry, Dipali, go ahead.
So finally, just wanted to know from you, how do you, planning, of course, has declined with the planning commission no longer being in place, etc. So could you talk about this whole process of decline? One is that, and in your book, you do write that there are some elements of Indian planning that still exist in the present time. So if you could talk about what has remained and what has collapsed of Indian planning. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that the decline of planning, despite the Planning Commission lasting from 1950 to 2014, right? So for most of independent India, we have a Planning Commission. But I'd say that the real heyday of planning in India is in the 1950s. from the late 1950s onwards, the prestige of planning begins to dip, right, from this very high level where it's seen as being in some ways more important than many ministries. It's seen as rivaling or being more powerful than the finance ministry in the mid-1950s. But the prestige of planning begins to suffer some diminution in the late 1950s with the failure of the second five-year plan. There's a foreign exchange crisis, which the Planning Commission is blamed for by the Finance Ministry. The Finance Ministry blames the Planning Commission for having an overambitious plan. And you see from the late 1950s, power slowly flowing to the Finance Ministry. The failure, the even more dramatic failure of the third five-year plan, which is between 1961 and 66, causes this criticism of the Planning Commission to become more generalized, much more widespread. And this failure is caused by a variety of factors, some of which, of course, can be attributed to the plan and the planners themselves. But it's also exacerbated by India, of course, has a war with China in 1962. It has a war with Pakistan in 1965. There are 2 years of drought in between as well. So all of these things contribute to the plan failing, and that really leads to a overall and institutional reappraisal of whether the Planning Commission justifies the amount of power it has. And so combine that with the death of Nehru in 1964, the Planning Commission also loses its chief patron, which means that the Planning Commission survives for many decades afterwards, and it remains powerful, but not nearly as powerful as it was in the 1950s, because from the mid-1960s onwards, the Finance Ministry, the next Prime Minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, Finance Ministers like Morarji Desai, and Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission themselves all believe in a sort of slightly pared down role for the Planning Commission, such that it becomes slightly more advisory vis-a-vis the PMO and the Finance Ministry. And of course, the Planning Commission comes to an end, is brought to an end by the Narendra Modi government in his first year in office in 2014, during the Independence Day speech on August 15th, as it had been widely anticipated. And I think that there were several reasons for it coming to an end under Modi. Of course, there is what has been reported, his sort of personal animus towards the Planning Commission through his years as the Chief Minister of Gujarat. The idea that he would have to go, a very popular chief minister, would have to go to Montek Singh Ahluwalia in Delhi and ask for funds from him, from someone who had never sort of stood for election in his life, that personally grated Modi, it has been reported. There is, we know with this government, with the Modi government, an anti-intellectualism, an anti-technocratic politics, and a populist politics, which could be justified in some ways, but certainly has its downsides, as we've seen in efforts like demonetization or the degrading of India's statistical infrastructure. And finally, there is the reason, which is also patently political, which is the need to eclipse what is seen as the Nehruvian legacy, the need to eclipse associations that India has with a Congress past, but particularly with an Nehruvian past. In terms of what persists of planning, I'd say that in some ways, what we have today with the Niti Aayog is more similar to what the Planning Commission had effectively become by, say, 2010, right? That the Planning Commission of 2010 is it's closer to the Niti Aayog of today than it is to the Planning Commission of the 1950s. Because by the early 2000s, the Planning Commission had really become a more advisory body, not a body that could dictate economic policy to the cabinet or to the finance ministry. That power shift had become quite clear. So I'd say that in some ways today what we have is that the difference being, of course, that today we have a government that doesn't seem to, at least in terms of optics at least, and in terms of some of the policies as well, doesn't seem to respect expertise in the manner that the Planning Commission seemed to, or the Prime Minister's office seemed to defer to expertise in the 1950s and 60s. That has some of its downsides. Perhaps there was too much technocracy, and that's something that I get into in the book. But there are also costs. Whether or not the Planning Commission made good decisions or bad decisions is a matter I leave up to economists. But I think that what economists also would not take issue with is the idea that India was following the advice of what most economists at the time were recommending. Economists themselves changed their mind, and by the late 1960s, people like Jagdish Bhagwati and Manmohan Singh, who were very much supporters of Nehruvian planning, begin to see to think that was a mistake. But that is a change in the views of economic experts, not a distinction between whether to listen to experts or not to listen to them. So I'd say that those are some of the continuities and some of the distinctions between what we had with the Planning Commission or with planning in the 1950s and 60s and with the situation of the Planning Commission in the early 2000s and with the Niti Aayog today.
Thank you so much, Nikhil, for talking to us and answering our questions very patiently. We wish the book more success and hope that our readers, listeners, and viewers actually also go back to it, and those who haven't read it, pick up a copy and get to it. So thank you once again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Rituparna. Thank you so much, Dipali. I really appreciate you inviting me here. It's been a pleasure.